So my talk actually has way more linkages with all of the other talks that have come across the day, and so I'm really very excited that some of the points will be pulled together. And also I am absolutely in awe of the roles that everyone in this room has in the care and support of children with rare epilepsies. And Danielle, you said it, that you as a parent are a CEO, a COO, everything to do with running your child's life as well as being a parent. And also some of you are honorary researchers and honorary paediatricians as well. You know so much. And so I hope that I can contribute to more knowledge that you have. So here we are. So achieving clinical trial readiness for the measurement of quality of life, and more measures also for children with developmental epileptic encephalopathies. So this is where I'm from. The new children's hospitals around Australia tend to have this green look with lots of sort of different pastels and colours and that. This is the Perth Children's Hospital, which is on a very large medical campus in Perth. And the Telethon Kids Institute is an independent research institute on the same campus. We're on the top 2 floors of what you can see in that slide. And we are, if we're most similar to an organisation such as the Murdoch Children's Research Institute in Melbourne, which most of you will be more aware of. So that's where we are, where we sit, and the sky usually is blue as well. And so here is me. Danielle explained, I've sort of got this vision that living with good quality of life is really what all of us have at the forefront of our minds, that guides day-to-day decision-making and activities. And so for all of the children with a developmental disability of some sort, there are rare genetic conditions. There are some conditions that are more common, and there are also a bundle of other research programs that I have led with the children with neuromuscular disorders. So I have a very wide scope in the area, in the children with whom I work. And we've had a lot of focus at Telethon Kids on natural history, looking at genetic antecedents, environmental determinants. There is the child, and then the outcome from that is how do those genetic and environmental factors affect outcomes such as the child's health and participation in the community, and of course, importantly, the family's health and well-being as well. And I recently started to focus much more heavily on quality of life, and really we didn't have a way to measure quality of life well in children with severe disabilities, or particularly intellectual disabilities, and really that needed work. And so I was lucky enough to get a grant where we could look at quality of life across the spectrum of developmental and intellectual disabilities, and we developed a tool called Quality of Life Inventory Disability, or QI Disability for short, and I will come back to that. And we looked really very, very comprehensively at the determinants of quality of life. And this now, by understanding the key determinants of how well a child is living, that is pointing me in my onward research, which is understanding how we can address those really key determinants of quality of life for children, such as sleep and pain, and also doing more studies so that we can measure impacts of any treatments for these children well. If we can measure them well, we better understand what the new therapies are delivering. So I work with Dr. Helen Leonard at Telethon Kids Institute, and some of you will know her. And years ago, she started work with Rett syndrome, and I joined her years ago as well. We work with the Australian Rett Syndrome Association, and also very, very closely with rettsyndrome.org, or the international association based in the US. And that has been fundamental to a lot of our natural history studies over time. And more recently, we've been very involved with work with the CDKL5 deficiency disorder, and that includes being partners really with the International Foundation for CDKL5 Research. And really these are two really interesting stories. The Rett syndrome work has followed a pathway of understanding natural history and now heading towards clinical trials and starting to bring more treatments onto the landscape. And that's been quite a long journey. It was first described 50 years ago, and we're now getting towards gene therapies for Rett syndrome. But the CDKL5 story, we're doing exactly the same thing. We're working with natural history, we're working with clinicians and centres of excellence and industry, and in a much faster time frame, we're getting to gene therapy trials. So we really have a very different way of working now. We have the internet. We can connect very readily with families. We can collect data online, and we can connect internationally so easily. So this pipeline is all the same. It's all the same steps that you have to understand, but it's much, much faster. And more recently, I've started to work with another organisation in the United States, DEEP Connections, and this is a group of different rare epilepsy advocacy groups, patient advocacy groups, I think about 20 in all, and they have combined with Combined Brain, which is a consortium which is interested in looking at outcome measures and biomarkers for rare genetic epilepsies. And together, I'm part of it now, we call ourselves Deep Combined Brain, so it's a really interesting name. But we have this node of work within that, which is called the Inchstone Project. And if you look at that picture, that sort of explains the Inchstone Project. You can have steps on a ladder that are widely spaced, and you take those steps, they're the equivalent of milestones in a child, or you could have steps in a ladder that are much more granulated and more smaller in size, so that if you can measure those smaller steps, then you would be able to measure a child's inchstones. And so I'm working with them to understand better the sorts of outcome measures that will be useful, particularly for children who are severely impaired, and will be heading into trials often without strong, valid outcome measures to really measure their progress. So it's exciting. It's a lot of international connections on that slide, but also very strong connections across, not just in Western Australia. We have to stretch widely if any of us are working in the rare disease space. So for today, I would like to describe the pipeline of validation that we work through when we're working up outcome measures in readiness for clinical trials. I'd like to discuss with you the concept of quality of life, and then present my own development processes of the quality of life measure, QI disability, and also look at health-related quality of life as well, because there is potential for us to have much more granularity in the notion of quality of life as it applies to the effects of epilepsy. So first of all, the pipeline of clinical trial readiness. It's not just getting the new medicines. We need those new medicines. We need all of those preclinical trials ready with the best theoretical basis and the best evidence of hopeful effectiveness in the children. So we need all of those pipelines of drug discovery. The second point is that we also need outcome measures that are valid and biomarkers that are valid and will help to us to indicate if there has been change. We absolutely need database infrastructures to be able to understand the natural history data, and I have heard from this room a lot of comments as to natural history studies, database work, and it might feel tedious to be filling out a questionnaire and explaining how your child is and submitting information over time, but it is extraordinarily important because we can start to understand not just 10 or 20 children, but hundreds of children when your reach is wide across Australia and internationally. And also, companies are starting to talk to us about our Rett syndrome and CDKL5 data and say, can we find children here who we could match to our upcoming gene therapy trials? So the natural history data for you, anyone who contributes natural history in relation to your child's condition, it is gold that will reap dividends over time. Patient advocacy groups, of course, are extremely important, and how parents themselves express their needs for their child, what they want to be different for their child, really plays a role in working towards strong trials and evaluating outcome measures. And also coordinated clinical networks. And there's been some discussion since Dr. Gill's talk just now as to how important having different centres of excellence who can link together and join and in delivering clinical trials as being a more efficient way than isolated clinical nodes on their own. So there really is a role here for not just all we can do as families and clinicians in contributing natural history data, in developing the best measures, developing the best drugs, but having that overarching network of clinical centres where clinical trials can be run. And with the rare disease clinical trials, families often have to travel some distance to get to that clinical trial site. And some of you may have been in trials here in Australia and gone from another state to Melbourne or another state to Sydney and so forth. And these are really quite substantial upheavals for everyone to manage, and you want to manage that well. And so the clinics actually start to accumulate experience even for managing the travelling families and managing those visits to the centres as well. So it's complex. And the outcome measures is really what I'm going to talk about today. So how do we create excellent and valid measures? So here is a little infographic that just shows you need your medicines and you need your outcome measures. And together they get built very solidly into the design of a clinical trial. And this is the business that goes behind making sure that an outcome measure will really map to doing what it is supposed to do. It needs to be fit for purpose and capture the right ideas about the concept. It needs to be reliable, and we can use it consistently and not having those scores or that outcome waving with effects that may not be important. How do the children actually score? Are they scoring in the middle of the range? Are they scoring with a floor effect, or are they all getting high scores so you couldn't actually measure a change? Does it measure what it's supposed to? Is it responsive and change in response to when the child changes? And then when you actually run it in a clinical trial, you need a really strong, clear manuals, you need training of the personnel on the ground so that it really can be implemented as it was tested and should then demonstrate the change as you are meaning to. So the tasks are all about, in the beginning of developing an outcome measure, you have to know the literature. You have to potentially collect interview data and understand the themes in that data and extract relevant items that are suitable to that concept. And that tells you in the first instance whether you're actually capturing the experiences of families. And then comes the field testing, where you have a much larger group of parents, and you would then look to its reliability, its structural characteristics, its validity, and its responsiveness. So it's all, there is a lot of work involved in being certain that outcome measures are suitable for the purpose they are intended. And then you're ready for the clinical trials and using those measures and hope that they really are good enough for that purpose. So this slide right here describes a study which we are NIH funded to do, and that is to develop clinical measures for to develop a whole suite of outcome measures and move them down this pipeline so that they really are ready for clinical trials. And we're at year 2 of that grant, and we aim to be finished in another 2 years. So this is for CDKL5, and it means by the end of this 5-year period we will have measures of motor function and hand function, communication, quality of life, and also we're looking at EEG as a biomarker as well. So it takes effort, it takes a coordinated group of investigators, and it really does take the investment that is important that it's afforded to treatments, but also to the development of outcome measures. So the importance of small steps is is reflecting the concept that if a child has severe impairments, the scores on the measure may be low. And that is called a floor effect. And that really is the work of our CDKL5 project, and also the work that I'm doing with the Inchstone group, is that we really want to stretch that floor effect out and understand nuances, understand greater granularity. And this is important for two reasons. If we have a new treatment that has produced small steps for that child that are missed when the steps in the measures are too large, then we miss those changes, and those changes could be meaningful to families. Also, if we cannot measure the small steps within a certain concept, and we may miss changes where the child loses particular skills. So we may miss where we have where there has been harm. So the small steps are important to understand improvement and to check whether or not there has been harm for the child. So we really need to be granular across the range of abilities. And one of the projects that is part of the Inchstone group where I'm working is looking at the Vineland Adaptive Behaviour Scale, which some of you will have administered or will have done, and looking at alternate ways of scoring those scores so that we can stretch out the range of scores so that the children with severe impairments are not sitting with very low scores that we cannot understand how they have changed. So this is just one slide of what we're doing with the CDKL5 work. We're collecting video clips according to a range of checklists of different tasks, gross motor tasks. We have 21 items, and families across the world are sending us these video clips, and we can understand head control and trunk control, sitting, standing, transfers and walking with these videos. And so this is very much in an early stage of development still, because it's a lot of work to collect these data. We have a hand function measure that is doing the same thing, where we are administering, where families send us video clips of their child's hand function, and we see terrific action in people's homes, and we can grade those, the way the child participates and responds to the task, so that we can understand a little bit more detail of that very basic functioning of grasping. So this measure is stretching out that floor effect in relation to grasping and picking up objects. And so what we can see on the right is we do see more children who are unable to grasp an object in our particular group, but we're also seeing more of those bars 2, 3 and 4 where components of that grasping is observed. So we're starting to reduce that floor effect for evaluating hand function. We've administered a communication measure, the Communication and Social Behaviour Scale, and which is designed for children with children to 2 years. So this is very early developmental communication skills, but very much on that big range of scores. We have a floor effect illustrated there, and this is something that is not acceptable to us as a measure of communication, which is one of the most important functions in relation to the parent and the child. And so we now have a program of work where we will tackle this and create a new communication measure for children with severe impairments, and we will be following the process that I'll now describe with our quality of life measure. So children with a developmental encephalopathy or a DEE have difficulties with their development and their functional abilities, and different comorbidities, of which the most prominent one is epilepsy. But there's also existing strengths. There's enormous capacity for children to learn at any level of impairment. There are capacities to enjoy activities and establish and maintain the social relationships. We see that time and time again, and that is largely ignored in many of the assessments of functioning. But so what this actually is, this balance of these difficulties and strengths in a child's daily life, that adds up to the concept called quality of life. It really is those feelings of experiences with your day-to-day life, and it includes your physical well-being, your mental well-being, your social well-being, being independent, and personal development as well. It's the most important outcome to a measure as an ultimate outcome for evaluating the treatments and the supports that the child receives. And when we talk to families, they tell us that this idea of feeling satisfied with your life isn't a soft outcome, it is their most important outcome, and that all professionals and all carers and trialists and clinicians should be supporting their child to achieve his or her best quality of life. So I take that very, very seriously and see that this understanding really is something that we all need to be on the same page about. So I talked earlier where we'd developed a quality of life measure and were able to look at determinants. And we were guided by this World Health Organization idea of a cartoon that describes components that you would observe in anybody with a disability. So there would be issues with body structure and function, for example, epilepsy, with the activities the child can do, for example, their communication or ability to walk, participation in the community, factors in the environment that might affect the child's disability, and also what they want to do as a person, their own personal factors of what they love doing or not. And there are, this all together adds up to and is intertwined with this idea of quality of life. With an NHMRC grant, we developed a quality of life measure for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we were also able to evaluate the predictors of quality of life, particularly sleep and pain were very big factors affecting the child's quality of life, being on multiple anti-seizure medications, difficulties with being independent to manage personal needs, and also limited participation in the community. These are all factors that are important, and they drive the new programs of work that I'm doing right now. So I call quality of life a grand outcome. At the end of all of those factors, here is the outcome that is how a child lives. And it's affected by health, your mental health, your relationships and the environment. And we can measure that with a measure called QI disability. So we started the idea of understanding what quality of life was for children across the spectrum of developmental and intellectual disabilities by talking to families. We talked to 77 families in all, and these next 3 slides are just showing you sample quotes of what parents were observing when things were going well for their child, and what they were observing when things were not going so well for their child. And what I've put into bold is what the sorts of information that we would extract and code that actually ultimately the sorts of became the items in our quality of life scale. So here are some quotes to do with communication and routines. And here also you can see the vocalizing, the body posture, making happy sounds, smiling, routines that a child is comfortable with. And with community immersion, enjoying nature and the outdoors was extremely strong, being relaxed, engaging with eyes, looking at you and smiling. And so from all of those 77 interviews, we developed a scale. We worked with families to speak the items so that we knew they were understood by all of the by parents. That is called cognitive debriefing, or think aloud. So we would administer the questionnaire and parents would speak what they understood the item to mean. And we also managed to adjust our wording to parents' wording, so each of the items are therefore much clearer and more accessible. And so this was the generation of the scale. We did the usual statistical analyses of factor analyses, exploratory and confirmatory factor analyses, and came to a questionnaire of 32 items. And we also repeated our factor analyses for the children who could walk and the children who could not walk. We repeated it for the children who could use words and the children who could not use words. And the factor analyses came out the same for both groups. So we were very confident that our scale could tackle the issues that were important to children across a spectrum of abilities. This slide shows you some of the example items in the scale. In the 6 domains of social interaction, negative emotions, being outside, doing activities in the outdoors, independence, physical health, and positive emotions. And just showing you what this looks like when parents see this questionnaire about their child's quality of life. So it has a lot of information on how it is performing that is setting it up to understand, does it meet the criteria of being fit for purpose, reliable and valid, and is it giving us information that is that we can use to evaluate interventions. If your vision is that every child with a DEE will live with a strong quality of life, then you want to know that you've measured it with a questionnaire that has validation data behind it. And it is now being used to support evaluations. It's being requested across the world, and it's being requested for clinics to evaluate their own departmental benchmarking and their own activities and to evaluate children in their units. It's being used in international registry studies, and it is also being used in clinical trials. There are at least a dozen clinical trials that are using quality of life now. And I think it's not just that we've done this work, right? It did not exist before this work came into being to have a scale that is appropriate and scaled to children across the range of developmental impairments. But it is also a factor that the FDA is not just wanting a seizure count, for example, but are also wanting to know, how is this child living? How is this child functioning? And so industry is much more open to using quality of life in their neurodevelopmental rare disease programs, and they're wanting to use this scale because it is developed for these children. So it's very exciting. And going forward, there's lots further to do if a goal is that not only the trials and your clinicians are thinking about quality of life, but also the health economic decisions and teachers at school and so forth, then there's an awful lot to do so that we really have a very strong framework evaluation that can guide how we help all children to live with their best quality of life. So, I almost said this, the unanswered questions. This is almost the same as what I just said, so I think I might move on from this slide, except the bottom point is regarding, especially with the work with the Inchstones group in the United States. They're very interested in understanding quality of life, but how does that relate to the child who has severe epilepsy? And this is what we'll come to now. Might a new module of a quality of life assessment be of value, and should we develop that? So I've been working with collaborators in the US. You can see their names listed there, and so here is going back the idea of quality of life being affected by health and psychological states, social relationships and the environment, all impacting the quality of how a child lives. And then there is this associated concept called health-related quality of life. And this you will see a lot, and it really is associated with particular health conditions. You might have an asthma quality of life scale. There are epilepsy quality of life scales. And really here is an opportunity for more sensitivity. And I would suggest that but what we do see in practice is that many of the health-related quality of life scales have a lot of overlap with the severity scale. So here is a list of symptoms, and by having the symptoms, you simply have a poorer quality of life, and that may or may not be true. and there is usually less focus on aspects that are important to a child, like how the child can engage socially and how the child can participate in the environment. So they're tending to be very oriented to lists of symptoms. So there are many health-related quality of life measures for epilepsy. Some have been adapted to be more suited to children with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and the bottom two points at the bottom, the ELD QOL scale, and there was one of the PEDS QOL suite of measures was developed for epilepsy, but had really limited consultation with those who care for children with intellectual disabilities. And so the scope of the domains is usually about seizure severity, side effects, neurological functioning, mood, behaviour, cognition and executive functioning. And much less commonly do you see the really important parts of quality of life, like being social and being community oriented, which every child does need. And just as an example, in the PEDS QOL module, the impact domain, hard to do daily tasks on their own as other kids, and in the cognitive domain, hard to understand what I read, and in the executive domain, function domain, hard to stay organised. And these are really difficult items to be clear about for your child, particularly if they have severe impairments. And so that is one of the two that has had some development in relation to children with disabilities. So I suggest that that is a gap, and to really understand how the seizures, when they're going well versus when they're not going well, how they really map to how the child is living, that could do with some additional scoping work. So looking at the infographic again of the pipeline of developing a good, robust measure, we have started the idea of, right down the bottom, the actions. We have started the process of starting to collect some interview data. So we're starting to see the differences in how children live when epilepsy is well managed and when it's not. So I had a student, Rushil Shah, who's shown here, and he was terrific in conducting quite a lot of interviews. We've done 20 interviews for 22 children. I don't know if any of you here were part of that study. And we had a range of different genetic epilepsy diagnoses, and almost all of these children were very affected by their seizures, as you would expect. And we asked, what's happening when your child's epilepsy is well controlled, and what's happening when it's not well controlled? And then we would probe, what would I see? Why do you think that is? How do you know? And it's the probing questions that give you the examples that tell you how that child is living, so that I could see that if I was standing there in that room. So we did find commonalities between the different measures that are available, but there was a lot of differences, and there were, so for example, quotes described the children's living, so that we could see what participation looked like and what participation was like when the child was unable to. So in terms of physical activity, well-being, having activity and energy, being very tired or sleeping all day, or being able to play, or being able to help with daily activities such as lifting her arm into her t-shirt when her seizures were being, were going well. Behaviour, the children's differences in their emotional regulation and being able to express emotions. For this little girl, very strong communication with her facial expression when things were going well for her. Differences in social engagement with family members and with others in the child's networks, joke making, lighting up when people are talking to them. Enjoyment of activities, the Santa sleigh ride here, a little girl who was awake the whole time, cooing and chatting and really loving that. Opportunities for learning when the seizures would come along and be frequent and and refractory, then learning often sometimes was lost again. So the child would then go through a cycle of learning a new skill and then having to relearn that new skill. And the opportunity for independence, and that might mean making your own choices. It doesn't mean doing everything independently, but opportunities for independence within the abilities. So being awake and being able to use your eye gaze device and say things that you need to say and make those choices. So I would argue that quality of life is a super important concept to everybody involved in supporting the children, and that we probably could look further at a health-related quality of life measure that is suitable for children with more severe impairments and in relation to epilepsy. So potentially the measurement of the broad concept of quality of life could be supplemented by an additional module for some of the more specific effects where you might find the granularity of effectiveness either in terms of gains for the child or in terms of losses for the child. So my final points, I come back to parents who have told us that quality of life is not a soft outcome. It is their most important outcome, and it is a grand outcome because it combines so many aspects of how we all live. There's an imperative for really strong measures for children who have severe impairments, and we owe them the same quality of measurement as we have for children across the spectrum of abilities. We know that a quality of life measure, like any outcome measure, needs to be fit for purpose, it needs to be consistent, and it needs to be responsive to change and tell us what we should be learning about that particular concept. All of those bars are necessary to meet for all of the outcome measures that are used in clinical trials. I would suggest that lots of measures are not grounded in the grassroots experiences of the children and their families, and we really need to make sure that our measures can capture granularity across the levels of functioning so we can stretch out any floor effect that there might be. I think that's me. Thank you. I think that's me.
Thanks, Jenny. That was great. Now, do we have any questions in the room? While we're waiting for questions, I'm going to ask one myself. I'll just get close to this. So you were talking about two elements which interested me around the quality of life measure, and that's the communication. Because I suppose I'm not alone in the room. When we applied for school, we had the communication, the Vineland, I think it is, and it's irrelevant for a non-verbal child. So I just wondered if that's do you see that in the immediate future, that the communication tool that you're going to build out, could that be functional in the education space? I saw it was on your far right side of your slide.
I might not have said every word. Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
We have adapted QI disability with teachers to become how teachers teach, what they see, how they can observe a child, and to bring all of the items into being, mapping to their, I guess you call it their pedagogical theory. So absolutely, and teachers should be thinking about quality of life and independence and personal fulfillment just as much as parents want to be. I think with the communication, we know that this measure for children to 2 years, and these are children who cannot use words, so this is this same group of children, and if we have a floor effect, we're not measuring really what that child can do and what they might not be able to do. So absolutely, and our work is focusing on children who do not have verbal abilities, so that we can actually come to much richer examples of communication. The children communicate. There are lots of ways that the children communicate. There's no way that you could have a score of 0 or 2 or 3. That is just not the case. And so we have to do better than that. There's humour, there's all these things that children are doing, and we want to know that those skills are maintained or improved. I think the Vineland is really interesting. It is really difficult for families to complete a Vineland because you get to a certain point and then your child is unable to do all of those skills higher up in that scale. And my colleague, as part of the INCH group, Stone's group, is working with data sets using the Vineland for children who do have severe impairments, but looking at different ways of scoring that. And so that even if you didn't complete the whole Vineland, but you could differently score those earlier skills, does that help in giving us more granularity? The answer, it might, but you still need the right items because then you're getting what is real to the child. And so I think there is a real role for having a good look at this with solid interview data. And we really know how to do that from our quality of life work.
Great.
I hope that's an answer.
Yes, it has.
Yeah.
I've got one more question, sorry, before, and that was around biomarkers. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you covered it properly,
no.
but what's the reality of using the quality of life score as a biomarker in future?
It's not a biomarker.
Could it?
A biomarker is like something to do with an epilepsy trace or a molecule or some level of a drug. Not a drug, but some level of something that is in your metabolism that is changing with the disease.
So it's not a biomarker because it's subjective?
It's a parent report measure. And coming back to what you said about the communication, the eye gaze technology, the new communication devices that are giving children different educational experiences will, in one day, I hope not too much longer, we will be able to ask children to rate their quality of life as well. We're not there yet, I don't think. Not to do that with, we all talk to children, but as a measure that we know is valid and reliable, we are not there. So it is, what I'm talking about are mostly their patient report or parent report measures, and so they are not biomarkers.
Okay. Got it. Loud and clear. We've got a question up the back.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Joe. I'm a little girl with Watts deficiency. I'm actually in the fortunate position at the moment where we're moving towards a gene therapy clinical trial, and obviously there's a lot of outcome measures and lots of natural history study work to be conducted. I was just curious, incidentally, I've been chatting with Terry Joe at Deep Combine as well, so great work over there.
It's a small world.
What is the actual end goal or state of the work that you are doing in combination with a lot of the other scientists and researchers in this space? Do you basically want to provide pharma with a tool set that they can tap into when they want to, develop outcome measures, and especially these sort of more fine-grained outcome measures? Is the idea to have a standardised sort of scale that's going to be put out there? I'm just wondering how pharma especially would be able to tap into the work that you're doing.
We've got it. Okay. So they do because we're published. Okay. They read the literature and they make contact with us to say, can you tell me more about this? And then they'll decide whether or not that suits their drug, the mechanism, the program they've got. It's not, there's no secret to the development work, and that is the imperative of research to be published. It passes the test of peer review to get into a publication, but then everyone can see it and make up their own minds. So the goals of my work are to keep going, to really to validate measures of what suits my skill set. One is quality of life, but also with my therapy background, the functional abilities areas is very well suited to where I'm very comfortable with that area. So that is what I am aiming to do, is to find measures that are suitable and fit for purpose and have enough data behind them to know that they are a good bet to use to test, because they're the measures that are being used to test these treatments that are taking millions of dollars to develop, and we want them to be fantastic for the children, but we need to be able to document that, and that's part of clinical care and identifying any adverse effects as well. So having valid outcome measures is really a lot of my work.